Hi, hello, and welcome to the Moving OT's Community of Practice for July 2026. So we're joined today by Emily Peckham, Gareth Jones, and Tris Burke from the Co-Spaces team. They're going to talk to us about alleviating barriers using a kind of community physical activity model for people with severe mental illness and the Co-Spaces project. So I'll let Emily, Gareth, and Tris explain a little bit more about that and introduce themselves a little bit more.
Thanks, Lisa. Tris, are you okay to share screen and we'll kind of get started, I guess? Or should we introduce ourselves a little bit first and then kind of
go for it.
Yeah. So as I'm talking, I'll introduce myself. So yeah, I'm Dr. Gareth Jones. I work at Sheffield Hallam University, and I have a background in physical activity and behaviour change. So originally started off in a sport and exercise undergraduate degree, and then did a master's and a PhD in behavioural health psychology. So looking at how we look at psychological theory to underpin how we improves people's health and well-being using health behaviours, and I typically focus on physical activity behaviour. And then I've kind of focused much of that within mental health research, and then been working with Emily and Tris and a bit with Liz Fletcher as well on the call within the Spaces and Co-Spaces programme, which is about, as we said, supporting people with severe mental illness.
Want me to go next? So my name is Dr. Emily Peckham. I'm a mental health services researcher. So I did a PhD in health services research and then went into mental health research. And the area I look at is around supporting people with severe mental ill health. So people who've experienced psychosis, bipolar disorder, to improve their physical health. So previously I worked on the smoking cessation study, and currently I'm working on the study with Gareth and Tris, looking at supporting people to be more physically active and less sedentary. So that's me. I'll pass over to Tris now.
Hello everybody, so I'm Dr. Tris Burke. Only sort of recently got my PhD, but in health sciences, and a prime focus for me is physical activity in blue and green spaces, and looking at support within the groups. And then prior to that, I was working in adventure activities as an educator, and then training and assessing delivery instructors. So I've done quite a lot of that. So it's me that's got the dubious role of sharing everything. I apologise now if anything goes wrong, but I think Lisa's managed to sort me out, which is fantastic. So we'll just.
I love that I'm the tech person. That always makes me laugh.
So hopefully you can see my screen, and I'll just share that from the beginning. Is that all okay there, Lisa? Is that?
Yeah, we can see that fine. Thanks, Tris.
So what we're going to do is we're going to just we've divvied up the slides between the three of us, and I'm going to just start by handing over to Gareth to introduce Spaces and Co-Spaces.
Thanks, Tris. Yeah, so start off with, as you can see from this first slide, it's a multi-institutional programme, Spaces / Co-Spaces. So we've worked with various partners such as Sheffield Health Partnership University, University of Leeds, University of Sheffield, York St John, Bangor, Sheffield Hallam, Sport for Confidence, so yourselves, and also NHS, TEW, so Tees Esk and Wear Valleys. It's going to come up with a programme around supporting those with severe mental illness to live a more active life, so to move more and be healthier and happier for that, essentially. So yeah, do you mind just skipping on to the next slide, Tris? So there we go. So you may be wondering what Spaces stands for. So Spaces stands for Supporting Physical Activity Through Co-Production for People with Severe Mental Illness. So it's an NIHR programme, so the National Institute of Health and Care Research, and specifically it's a programme grant for applied research. So that's quite notable. They're quite large grants, but they're very applied in nature. So as well as being heavily sort of theory driven and having good methodologies, and they're also very pragmatic at the same time. So there's a continual sort of learning process as we kind of go through. It's a 6-year, or originally funded as a 6-year long trial. We just had a year's extension as well, so 7 years, with the key aim to develop and evaluate an intervention which supports people with severe mental illness to live a more physically active life. And it's important to think about activity here is around movement. We're not talking about exercise, HIIT classes, your real sort of what you might traditionally think of when you think about activity, but we're really talking about movement. How can we encourage people to move more kind of every day or in everyday life? It can be exercise classes and so on, but it doesn't have to be. It's more around that. It's more general than that. And then next slide. So there's a decent kind of understanding and literature around mental health and physical activity. So we know that low physical activity and high sedentary behaviour, that they're two independent risk factors but are closely entwined, have a really, really strong link with various health issues such as cardiovascular disease, metabolic risks such as obesity, and so on. We also know that mental health issues and also illness also have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and so on. And we also know that there is a real strong link, both relationship and causality, or through causality, around the positive health benefits one can have from increased physical activity behaviour. So we know typically the more people tend to move, especially from a very sort of sedentary background, if we can move people along that sort of continuum and get them more active in everyday life, that can have a real significant effect on somebody's mental and physical health. And we also know that physical activity improves sort of self-report, sort of mental health and well-being as well. And then when we look at SMI specifically, so severe mental illness, if we kind of take a step back and look at the broad church, typically those with SMI have an age gap compared to those without SMI of about 15 to 20 years, and 70% of those deaths are attributed to preventable physical health conditions. And as I kind of previously mentioned, they tend to engage in very low physical activity behaviour and quite high sedentary behaviour. We also know that physical activity and sedentary behaviour link with physical health conditions, as I kind of mentioned before. So I kind of often use this sort of provocative sort of thing. So therefore, if we know the gap and we know what can support that, that's kind of job done. We can kind of move on to the next stage, where there's actually, well, we know from behaviour change research, it's a lot much more complex than that. And there's a lady quite pivotal in behaviour change research called Susan Michie, and she often talks about this acronym, ISLGIAT. And it stands for, it sounded like a good idea at the time. And this is what a lot of, if you really go back quite far in research, historically, a lot of research was kind of positioned on, in that it sounded like a good idea to do this. So if we've got this as the problem, we'll come up with a solution, and then we'll do the research on that, and we'll try to understand, what impact did it have, and so on. Whereas that's now really seen as a bit of a relic as far as a research method. Now we try to kind of identify the problem. So that first step is still the same, but then we really have a deep dive into, well, why is that the problem? How is that the problem? What are the ingredients of that as the problem? Why is that caused? And really not trying to treat just the symptom, but also the cause of that symptom as well. So in this example, that early onset of death is kind of the symptom of a life lived through unhealthy sort of behaviours like low physical activity behaviour and so on. So take a real deep dive into that, and then co-produce solutions or potential solutions that directly impact those problems or barriers and so on, and then wrap the research into it. So that's more kind of, that's essentially what we've done within spaces and co-spaces. So on to the next slide, please. Yeah. We also know that those with SMI have unique and significant barriers beyond the general population to engaging in physical activity behaviour. So, for example, stigma is a big one, medication side effects and so on. There might be a lot of anxiety or fear around accessing community spaces, and also tend to be have quite limited social connections as well. So social opportunities tend to be somewhat limited. So that go beyond the kind of general population. So there's quite significant hurdles that are needed to be supported to support those with SMI to engage in increased physical activity behaviour. And then next slide. So this positions some kind of key questions. So how do we support first steps in being physically active for those with SMI? We often know that the first step can be the hardest. And then so that second question is kind of really pivotal. Well, if we've made that first step, which can be extremely difficult and often needs a multi-component intervention just to kind of make that first step, how do we maintain that behaviour? We've probably all got some sort of background in January we'll try to eat a bit less, drink a bit less alcohol, be a bit more active, but by February 1st most of those plans are out the window, and it's actually very, very hard to maintain a behavior and to kind of stick with it sort of long term. So that was one question we're kind of looking to kind of answer. And how can physical activity be integrated into routine NHS care? Again, really, really difficult, a huge research question in itself. Generally, we can think about how do we increase physical activity, but how do we make that part of routine NHS care? And again, that needs to be system-wide, really, to make it, to have a systematic kind of widespread approach. And how to integrate physical activity into various sort of settings, community settings and so on from the NHS, and how do we really connect community and NHS providers? And then what are the real key, again, going back to that is the sort of slide, what are the key sort of barriers and enablers of NHS and community provider kind of collaboration? So what are those things that we have to, those hurdles that we have to kind of overcome? Because perhaps within the NHS on its own or within the community providers on their own, we might be able to provide systems, but actually the real spark, the real kind of magic happens where those two work collaboratively together. So how do we kind of do that in a more efficient way, essentially? And then next slide, and I think this is where I pass over to Emily because she was the real instigator for getting this trial going. So yeah, pass over to Emily.
Thanks, Gareth. So I'll just tell you a little bit of the background to the mental health research that we've been conducting. So as Gareth already said, Spaces is a funded study, and our aim is to co-produce a physical activity intervention delivered within existing NHS services. And we're currently conducting a national randomised controlled trial to determine whether the Spaces intervention is effective or not. But one of the key components of the intervention is having a link between NHS and community physical activity providers. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as we go through the slides and just talk a little bit more about what the Spaces intervention exactly is. But really, when you're developing any intervention, that's going to be provided in the NHS, it's no good if it just lasts for X number of weeks and then that's the end of it and the person just goes back to how they were before, because there's no link, no thought about how they're going to be able to maintain that physical activity. So that's where this NHS community provider connection really comes in and is really important. It's about supporting people to find a way of maintaining the physical activity. So within our intervention, they begin the activity within an NHS intervention, but then we try and support people to continue that as they move forward with their life and gain a bit of confidence in being active. Because what we found through talking to people is a lot of people haven't been active for a long time. They were quite anxious about it, didn't know what it would entail, potentially a bit anxious about leaving their homes. So all that was built into the Spaces intervention. And the SCO Spaces project, which was a spin-off project from the main Spaces study, was to work out how to better connect the NHS mental health teams and the community providers. So when we were working through the Spaces intervention, we realised that there was a bit of a gap in knowledge and a bit of more work was needed really to support NHS mental health teams to interact with community providers, and also to support community providers in interacting with people with severe mental ill health. So some people had got a lot of experience of working with people with severe mental ill health and some people hadn't, and we really wanted to support people and help them be a bit more confident, all in all. And then the final bit of work that we're doing at the moment is a much smaller grant that's looking at physical activity and early intervention services and how we can support people when they first become unwell to be more active, so that hopefully people don't go on to become inactive for long periods of time. So it's a sort of holistic package that we're trying to work through with people who've been inactive and been using mental health services for some time, supporting them to be more active, supporting them to then take part in activity within the community so that it's sustainable, and also supporting people who've just become unwell to not lose being physically active and moving. So next slide, please. So the Spaces study basically was, we spent a year developing our intervention. The intervention was developed through a co-production process. So that was with people with lived experience, people with carers, you know, who'd looked and supported people with severe mental ill health. So what there might be an informal carer, a family friend, member of family, you know, that kind of thing. Once we co-produced the intervention, we then tested it in a small-scale feasibility study where some people received the intervention and some people just received standard NHS care. We conducted that in 6 NHS sites, and we found the intervention to be feasible to deliver within the NHS and acceptable to people. It was at this point that we realised we needed to better link with community physical activity providers and people who work in NHS mental health services. So that's where the Co-Spaces study came in. And at the moment, we're conducting our full-scale randomised control trial with approximately 20 NHS sites. And we're bringing in the learning from our Co-Spaces study, which Tris will tell you a bit more about, into this full-scale trial. And our final work stream is looking at process evaluation, knowledge mobilisation. So looking at what works, how it's worked, and then disseminating what we've found. Next slide, please. This just tells you a bit about the co-production process. I won't go into that in any detail, but basically what we did was, it was sort of a 4-stage process. We conducted some reviews of the literature, we conducted some focus groups, we brought all that together in what we called a consensus group, explained to the people who were people with lived experience, carers, mental health clinicians and physical health clinicians, what we'd found so far. They thought a bit about what components an intervention might need to contain. We then did some more evidence review. We conducted some more focus groups. We further refined the intervention, thought a bit more about what it needed to contain, really drilled down into that. And then we did some think aloud interviews with people to talk through the intervention, see what they thought about, did it work in practice, before doing the feasibility study. And then after the feasibility study, we conducted some interviews with people who'd received the intervention, people who delivered the intervention, and from that further refined the intervention. So that's just a quick bit about the co-production process. Next slide, please. This just tells you what the intervention components are. So it's a group intervention. It's an 18-week intervention. People were very, very certain that they wanted some sort of group intervention. Some people didn't, but the vast majority of people said they wanted something that they could do together with other people, and they wanted a social element, and that was really, really important to people, that there would be a social element. People also wanted one-to-one consultation, so before they started the group, to meet with what we call a physical activity coordinator to discuss any needs that they might have, how they were going to get to the venue where the intervention was, did they need any special considerations, was there anything that the physical activity provider needed to know. And then there was some follow-ups throughout the 18-week period, just to ensure that people were okay, keeping their motivation, and towards the end then understanding how they might go on to continue being active, and thinking about maintenance really there, which was really important. People were also given a participant handbook which explained some simple activities that people could do in their own homes, and some simple tips like, you know, you could walk to the shops rather than take a bus if it's not too far, or you could go up and down the stairs, you know, just a few simple tips to help people build activity within their life. People were offered an activity monitor, so a simple pedometer that they could use if they wanted to, and they were offered texts to remind them to come to the intervention session, and the social support, which was a really key element of the intervention, which I've already spoken about. Next slide, please. And just to explain that the intervention is based on behaviour change techniques, so it's based on the COM-B, which is a behaviour change theory. And this slide is really just so that you know that it's based on, there's a theoretical underpinning. I won't go into that in any depth, but just that there is a theoretical underpinning that underpins the intervention, and we did think about it. Next slide, please. And this slide tells you about the different behaviour change techniques that we used within the intervention. So the Spaces intervention features 30 plus behaviour change techniques, which are grouped into 14 different themes. So you can see these are some of the themes here. So self-belief, feedback and monitoring, reward and threat, comparison of outcomes, you know, all the different things that are built in are there. And again, I won't go into all of those because that would take too long for today, but we'll just go into the next slide, please, and I'll just explain some of the key elements of the intervention. So I already told you the social aspect was really important. People thought it was really important doing things with other people who were in the same boat as them. And that opportunity to make social connections, form social support. And when we talked to people about the intervention after, when we interviewed them afterwards, people had started going out a bit more. They'd got a bit more confidence. They were able to be a bit more social within their everyday lives. So it wasn't just about being more active. That social element had really supported people within their everyday lives as well. That was so important. Consistency was important to people. There was a key consistent location, a time, the same time every week. The consistency of the people who were delivering the intervention, the physical activity coordinators, and the other people in the group who they could get to know. So consistency, really important. The location was really important. People wanted it to be in a neutral venue, not an NHS setting where they may have been unwell and remember you know, not great memories of not being terribly well. So in a neutral community venue, that was really important to people. They felt more confident going there. And they wanted the people who delivered the intervention to have some element of mental health training so that they understood the particular challenges that people who've experienced severe mental ill health face. And they wanted some people who had soft skills, so people who knew how to talk to people and knew the challenges, and a person-centred, so looking at the person and what that person needs, rather than something that's just for everybody, but the ability to tailor to the needs of the people within that group. So that comes into flexibility and variety. So looking at different elements of being active, so going for an outdoor walk, doing some indoor style activities, giving people a bit of a taster of different types of activity. And one of the key elements and where community physical activity providers came in there was having some community group taster sessions, things like walking football or walking rugby, where somebody who delivered that within the community would come to the group, deliver that session to the group in the hope that then people would feel a bit more confident and then go on and try you know, continuing with that activity like the walking football within the community provision. And that provided a really useful link where people could then carry on and maintain their levels of physical activity. And co-spaces is really where we were trying to further build the strengths in that area. People could, you know, if people couldn't attend the group for 1 week, they could still come back. It wasn't that if you didn't come for a few weeks, that was the end, you couldn't come. You could carry on. A positive culture, really supportive, encouraging each other and, you know, an encouraging environment. I've already talked through the multi-component intervention, so I won't dwell on that. It's 18 weeks. And this time frame enabled stability, predictability, people getting their experience up, reducing their anxiety, getting their confidence up, feeling able to interact with the group members, and then hopefully going on to carry on being active. And hopefully in some cases, and we found this, that some of the group members went on and continued with the community physical activity together. So they formed friendships, and that was really, really important to people. So that's the key ingredients. Next slide, please. So the type of PA interests, you know, physical activity interests, so people had different interests. So the group could be tailored to what people's interests were, and the coordinators talked to people about what they've done in the past, what they might be interested in the future. That's really, really important. The importance of the venue and having that coordinator, the location, it's really important that the venue was, you know, warm and friendly and welcoming. It didn't really matter so much where the venue was, and it needed to be easy to get to. So it didn't need to be the most fancy venue. If people could get there on one bus, once people had to start getting 2 buses, that became a bit challenging for people. So something that was easy to get to and welcoming when people arrived. And I've already said the physical activity coordinator, experience them with soft skills. I've talked about the motivators, the social, the community engagement, that connection with mental health teams. That was really important. And that one-to-one behavioural support was really critical to understanding barriers particular people might face to undertaking physical activity. So trying to problem solve with people before they started coming to the intervention, and then during the intervention, if anyone experienced any challenges, understanding what those challenges were and trying to support people to overcome those challenges. That's really important as well. Next slide, please. So now I'll pass over to Tris, and she's going to tell you about co-spaces and where that all fits in with the community within the spaces intervention. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, in addition to what you've seen on the previous slide with regards to our findings from workstream 2, one of the key factors, as Emily's already mentioned, is that those networks between providers and the NHS staff, for some folk that was fantastic and they were able to do lots with regards to community provision, but for many of the NHS staff, those networks just didn't exist. And likewise, community providers that had worked specifically with severe mental illness, not just mental illness, but severe mental illnesses, were quite limited as well. So co-spaces was then brought about, and that had 3 phases in it. It started with a round of interviews with community providers and with all of the packs that had been in workstream 2. So all of them were invited to take part, and we wanted to hear from them specifically on this topic. And then once we'd got our information from the early interviews and from the national survey, we brought all of that information together and looked at some multi-stakeholder workshops. And this is where we also invited in people with lived experience of SMI to also help us to decide what sort of resources we could create for people. So I'm going to talk mostly about the workshops, really. As I said, it was a multi-stakeholder co-production process, and it followed this double diamond design process whereby we look at what the problem is through discovering and defining the problem, and then we look at what the solution is through developing the solutions and delivering on them. And we've got a couple of other sort of pictures there in this slide. One of a sailboat. We use the sailboat analogy quite a bit in lots of the workshops we deliver. And then we're looking at sort of impact and effort. So yes, impact might be very high, but if it also requires really high effort, then we're not going to be able to fulfill that. And certainly we're quite limited in the budget. The yellow area on the box that you see there is if it's high impact and least effort, then we know that that's going to be a great solution that we can action plan well. So there's 6 stages to this process. You sort of agree and define a question, you identify the problem, and then you prioritise those problems. Then you identify solutions, prioritise those solutions, and then create an action plan for those solutions. And you can just see on some of these following slides the stages that we went through. Okay. So workstream sort of workshop 1 there, we looked at discover and define. So we broke the tables. There were 2 workshops, one in London and one in Sheffield. And on those tables, we basically had various people looking at all the problems that they thought were issues. They would actually put it into the sailboat analogy document there, into the poster. We use a sailboat because we're looking at basically the anchor weighing people down, the water making people feel like everything is sluggish, the seaweed getting in the way. And at the top of the page, we might look at things that actually start, make things very easy for folk. Once we've done that, we then prioritise those problems. And the way in which we had the group members prioritise those were with lots of sticky dots. So on the yellow pieces of paper, you can see the questions that we were asking, which was mostly about how can we help NHS staff actually engage more readily with people in the community, with community providers of physical activity. And then the groups from each table would actually prioritise those, stick lots of dots on. There isn't much discussion around these elements at the moment, but it does mean that we can very quickly get to identifying problems. Once we did that, we were then able to identify and prioritise the solutions, which you can see on the picture on the left here. And then we also had to consider the effort and the impact. And so all the solutions that you can see on the left there, the ones at the top are the ones that have got the most dots, and then it obviously progresses further down. So the top two there were then placed onto the impact and effort chart. And you can see here that one of the solutions we felt was going to be highly impactful, but not take too much effort. And the other one was going to be, again, highly impactful, but would take a lot of effort. And we'll come on to what those elements were later on. So from that then, once we'd done that, we were able then to create an action plan for realistic solutions. And lots of people came up with great ideas. Again, we tried to prioritise those. After this workshop, or after these two workshops, the central team then went away. We actually took all of the things that were written and we put them into a massive table. And then we were able to come up with findings that we could then go back to our groups and talk about. So we met in a second workshop where we were looking at developing and delivering on what we'd discovered. And so we had all the results from workshop 1 that we put into like a traffic light system. So basically everything that was not very much effort and very impactful, easy to deliver on, we did that between these two workshops. And that basically comprised of updating the physical activity coordinators training, and we could do that pretty quickly. The other things that folk wanted were 2 infographics. One that obviously considered a venue, the venue use itself and how to circumnavigate challenges within that. This one would be aimed at the physical activity coordinators and also at the community activity providers. Something also that was needed is understanding what is SMI and what adaptations would be needed to the physical activity sessions that the community activity providers would need to deal with. And this was aimed at the community activity providers themselves and at people with lived experience so that they could read about what they could expect from a community activity provider. The other thing that we felt was really going to be impactful, but we didn't think at the time we would be able to do, was to create a video, which was aimed at everybody to raise awareness, raise attention, and get people a little bit more engaged. So in this second workshop, what we had folk do is they were able to look at a whole range of various publications that were already out there, maybe some videos, etc. And they had to spend time in their first task identifying exactly what it was that they enjoyed about those things or that they liked. Was it the font? Was it the readability, etc., etc. And then after that, we had the folk look at 2 groups, basically building on creating an action plan for all these sort of solutions that they were coming up with. And you can see here in the background on the posters that they'd also started to draw in things that they wanted to see on the poster. And those elements you'll be able to see on the infographic leaflet that we have, you know, people with speech bubbles. You might be able to see on the right hand picture here, there's a dotted line which shows that this is a journey, for example, and then obviously winning at the end, some sort of physical activity winning. And we've tried to incorporate all of those ideas into the actual, into the resource. The resource was then sort of created and mocked up, sent back to everybody for their approval, and then the final version of it was created. And I'm going to hand back over to Gareth, who will tell you more about that now.
Yeah, so thanks, Tris. That was a really good summary of kind of the process we went through. And it was worth saying, I don't know if I've made it that clear so far, but when we're talking about effort as far as co-producing the resources and so on, Effort was more around the original resource that we had available through the grant. So the CoSpaces grant, we had X amount of financial resource to go and create these kind of resources, and so that effort was largely in boundary around what could we realistically do within the resources that we had available. And so the kind of the program of resources that was kind of co-designed was around this kind of creating safe activity spaces for those with severe mental illness within the community. And hopefully we're going to demonstrate 2 resources now that for the use of people like yourselves on the call, such as occupational therapists across the country, around how do we perhaps better connect with community providers and so on. And so some of the kind of overarching aims, I guess, were kind of connecting the ask to wider community providers and kind of what the aims are. So getting rid of some of the stigmas and kind of what we're trying to achieve through those resources, such as some of the interventions that are kind of highlighted with as being impactful are things like creating a warm, welcoming environment. Being met with a smile was something that was kind of highlighted again and again and again. So kind of explaining what mental health and what mental illness kind of is, and importantly what it is not, and demystifying some of the needs of those with SMI. So Tris, are you able to share the resource? So if you we can share this round afterwards as well, but if you went onto our Spaces website, which is Spaces Project, all as one word, lowercase, .co.uk, you can scroll down a little bit and you'll find a downloadable version of this resource. So this resource is, you do need to bear in mind it's been designed for those with SMI specifically, so that's the narrative that we were co-designing this resource for. But hopefully we've tried to also make it, although not tested with, kind of there's some generalizable sort of take homes from it as well, and you'll see what those are as kind of get towards the end. But this is all around creating the welcoming and safe activity spaces, and that was the real key part of it. It wasn't saying create these really high energy activity places. It wasn't around having the best workout in the world. It was around having some of that where people feel safe and people feel welcoming. So as Tris is kind of scrolling through, if you stop around there, if that's all right, Tris. So one of the first things that the resource does is kind of just give an outset of what the kind of the resource, the kind of booklet is for. There's got some useful information around what SMI is, so it defines it, and then also what it is not. And so it's often stigmatized and kind of chunked in with kind of learning disabilities and so on, which SMI is not. And also why, from the words of those with SMI, why physical activity is important to them as well. And then, as you can see here, we've kind of got Claire here is our sort of a made-up person, but kind of this kind of journey of how accessing physical activity opportunities within the community, things that can help make it easier for him, that person to be active in the community. So what it feels like to experience psychosis. So they might hear voices, the medication makes them kind of feel quite tired and so on. So again, just so we can empathize a little bit, because a lot of people, when we did our big survey at the start of CoSpaces program, we found that there was a lot of unknowns. People didn't really understand what SMI was and kind of what it was not, and there was lots of broad brush kind of stuff kind of going on. So there's a lot of misunderstanding there. The feelings make community, or sorry, these feelings make entering community environments kind of very intimidating and scary for kind of various reasons. So some of the things they might do to overcome that is come with a friend or a colleague or a carer. They might need a bit more of a break or more time during a session just to kind of gather themselves and so on. And kind of what support needs might make them feel more comfortable when entering a community venue. So as kind of mentioned before, these kind of soft skills, like a warm, respectful welcome, can make a huge difference. Be met with a smile, We've done lots of research within Sheffield and so on around leisure providers, and actually this isn't just SMI, but across various health conditions. There's already a wall, a barrier in front of lots of leisure providers and physical activity and sport and kind of provision, just inherently for those who haven't perhaps entered those venues before. So having that warm, welcoming face as soon as they kind of enter these kind of really it goes a long, long way. Being flexible in approach and so on. And then if you kind of scroll down a little bit, so yeah, during the activity, what actions might help a person with SMI cope with their condition during an activity a little bit more? So it's around not being overly kind of garish or noisy and kind of intimidating or kind of in the person's face. Having some perhaps quiet spaces nearby that they can go into. Understanding the environments, perhaps having a good tour, understanding where places are, what the exits are, how do they get somewhere, where the toilets are, how do they navigate to that specific room. They might feel really comfortable with doing the exercise, but getting to the room, and I go into quite large leisure providers, as a gym member myself, and to actually access the gym, you have to go through this corridor, up these steps, down another corridor, through this gate, and through that can be very intimidating for somebody. So having that kind of that real support about how do we actually get there. It's not just about getting through the front door, it's also about accessing the session and so on. Sometimes, name badges, that sort of stuff can go a long way. So again, some of the things that can help there. And if you scroll down a little bit further, this is a kind of real good sort of take home that we kind of found from or that was discovered during the co-design of this resource, with these 3 P's to consider. So people, place, and provision. So we need to really understand and kind of look at when connecting with community providers, the people that are there. Okay, so it's not just about the person providing the said intervention. It's also about the receptionist. It's about the caretaker. It's about all the person behind the coffee shop. It's about everyone that's kind of there, and are they having a good experience when they kind of meet with these people and so on. One bad experience with any one of those can throw the whole physical activity sort of idea kind of into the bin. So again, there's a kind of a checklist there of things to consider when what makes it more supportive for when meeting people in these areas. The place, again, something that surprise is probably too strong of a word, but really stood out to me as we're kind of going through this was the importance of the place. And that doesn't just mean kind of what it looks like from the outside, although that is a big factor, but how do you get there? Is it easy to access on public transport? Is there good signage to get there? And considering these when making any sort of referral or kind of supporting somebody with SMI to actually access these venues, how repeatable is this? If they get to this venue, it's idealistic, it's lovely, it's perfect. There's a really good kind of well engaging sort of community provider, really empathetic and so on, but actually the signage to get there and the public transport to get there is really difficult. Then actually that can be enough of a barrier in itself. So our patient public involvement engagement group, which kind of sit alongside any grant, they had a really nice sort of definition of SMI, and towards the end of that definition, they kind of summarize it in that everyday tasks that seem relatively simple can be made very daunting and very difficult, and that's a reality that people with SMI kind of live with every day. So we can't not think about the small things. They're really, really important. And the last thing there, so the 3rd P is around provision. So again, when we're thinking about the provision that goes on at that community venue, it's not just a one size fits all. It's not just they do this chair aerobics class, that'll be good for everybody. Actually really consider what is the provision. How do they, again, not to broad brush it too much, but people with SMI do have mobility issues or can, in tendency, perhaps due to their medication, they often have excess weight gain and so on. So, and if they haven't been very active in the past, getting different levels of mobility is very varied. So Again, just not thinking one size fits all, making sure there's a personal approach to that. How do we adapt these sessions? You know, something that we've really learned along Spaces and Co-Spaces so far is that when a session is provided, it might be great for 60% of the people attending, but 40% or 20% or whatever that might be, they didn't adapt the session for them. And by not adapting that, those 2 or 3 people then were really put off by coming back to future sessions. So that adaptability is really key, and ensuring that the provider knows that, okay, are you ready to adapt it? What if that's too hard? What if it's too easy? Can you adapt it? And just having that nod towards there. Having taster sessions, you know, not having to sign up to a 6-month program straight away, you know, it can be a kind of a real key one. And also that's kind of social element. So is there kind of a time to socialize, get to know each other's names? You know, we really hit home in our Spaces intervention that there's a big social element. So we learn people's names very quickly. It's built into the warm-up, it's built into the kind of sessions themselves, kind of get to know one another. Because one of the key motivating factors for those with SMI, not everyone, but you know, Emily mentioned this before, but a significant element is that social element to reduce loneliness, and that's why they want to engage in physical activity. So just remembering people's why, and so building that social element into a physical activity session is kind of really key. So they don't just get in, do the session, get out again. That's perhaps not why that person wants to attend that physical activity session. So yeah, I just want to kind of highlight that. So that kind of is that resource. So again, it's a really helpful resource. And then off the back of that, we had a bit of underspend, so we managed to pull a video together, which when you're trying to connect with, and this is for OTs, to connect with community providers, we found a video would might be a really nice entry to introduce, well, what is SMI, and kind of get that across the experience of community providers themselves and experiences from OTs such as yourselves in how they've engaged community providers and the impact that physical activity has for those and so on. So we've created a few videos which are going to be on our website. One's 1, 3 and a 5-minute video. We're just going to show you the 3-minute video now, which kind of hopefully is a nice pitch to any community provider you might want to engage with. So yeah, I'll leave it to Tris to play that video, and hopefully you can all hear it. The sound isn't coming across for me, Tris.
No, I can't hear it either.
I'll just stop sharing, and then I'm just going to share again and toggle it. Isn't that amazing? We had toggled it earlier and we've gone back. So I'll just share again. Maybe it runs out after a certain while, but I'll just share again now.
No worries. So for anybody who's wondering how to share sound, we worked out that if you go on the share button at the top and there's a little toggle in the top right, I'll teach this to everybody now because it was something that I learned not that long ago. So yeah, just wait for Tris to redo that.
Yeah, so I'll just okay, so hopefully you can see the screen again.
Yeah.
If it weren't for Paddy and Sam and groups like this, I would have never thought about coming to the fitness group, because I built up trust. It is a relationship, yeah, it's good, like a community. There's people in the same position as me, or have been in the same position, who can relate to each other. We know we've got or had problems or got problems, and just feel relaxed.
Yeah, so people off there that suffer from mental illnesses, they stay quite sedentary, sat still on a ward or in their own home. People that only come out maybe a couple of times. So we have to give people this chance, and we do that with a few groups. People often make like long-standing friendships at these groups. It's very important.
So community providers are really, Those with severe mental illness often have unique barriers to accessing opportunities within the community to be active. And so a community provider who is well versed and understands those barriers and perhaps techniques and so on to overcome those barriers is really important to supporting those with severe mental illness.
We are never going to be the people who turn away anybody. So if somebody comes and they've got a group and they want to use the space to help support people with severe mental health issues, it's a no-brainer for us. It's, yeah, absolutely, what can we do? What can we give to you? It's the whole message for us is anybody can come down here and find something to do, no matter who you are.
I like attending community sessions because I suppose I've been ill and at times I've been kind of isolated, and that brings all sorts of people from all sorts of life, because all sorts of people get mental health problems, and it makes you feel like you're part of something and not on your own.
We try and boost people's community capital by setting up a community-based group that they can be part of and feel part of. Maybe their mental health has recently spiraled, and physical exercise is not the silver bullet, but it's part of a number of things a person can do to boost their capital to bring about positive change for themselves.
Impact, it gives me lappers and it gives me a routine. Every week I get up and go somewhere and do the same things, and I make friends with the people I meet.
We have ourselves, we have our family, some of us have a workplace, but we also need community as well. So we need spaces where we can go to that we feel we belong in.
Thanks, Jess. So that video will be also on our website, so you'll be able to download that and send that to folk as well. I think it's going to be put on YouTube imminently, and then a link to that, so that can be kind of shared quite easily across that. But again, hopefully that just hits across the messaging around, you know, from a community provider, from an OT, and from a lived experience person around kind of the importance around physical activity in the community. But yeah, I'll just pass over to Tris to finish off, and then that'll be us. Thank you.
Yeah, so in sort of conclusion, really, these are our four main things. You know, those people with SMI want to be active through the NHS, and importantly, they want to be active through community settings, but they do need that guiding hand, which obviously you guys as OTs are really aware of that already. But their journey is very complex, and, you know, needs individual help. Another important conclusion is that the NHS community provider connection is key. It's absolutely key, especially when it comes to sustainability. And so more and more, we're trying to encourage our physical activity coordinators to get those community sessions in as soon as they can, and to help their participants to move into the community, so that when they get to the end of the intervention, they don't just drop off a cliff like they would with many interventions. Hopefully they'll slide, they might dip a little bit, but then they'll get picked up again. We also then need to think about how do we sort of strategically integrate community physical activity opportunities into routine SMI care. And again, that NHS community provider link is essential. And then lastly, it's the community providers themselves improving their mental health awareness, and not just of general mental health, but severe mental illness, and understanding, you know, their understanding could support people with SMI engage more fully in community-led activities. And that's where we would like to take CoSpaces on to next. And we're applying for some more funding now that looks at developing resources and training tailored specifically for the community providers themselves. Okay, if anybody has any questions, we're happy to answer anything, although I think we might run a little bit over. And you can get all of us through LinkedIn, and if you've got any sort of specific questions that you want to ask, or later on after this, you can email Emily on the email address there.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. That was a really great presentation and took us through a lot of information. I've got loads of questions myself, but I know we've got a couple in the chat that have been answered already. So thank you, Emily, for jumping in and answering some of those questions about how to access the intervention and what services people needed to be part of in order to, think about joining and participating in that research. Liz, go for it.
More a comment than a question. Thank you. I've been involved in both projects, as you know, for quite some time, but I've not heard it presented like that altogether. So it's actually really nice for me to hear the project sort of in its entirety, and so it's just brilliant work, I would say, for one, and two, just I actually have been slightly guilty of not really thinking too much about my OT role when I've been part of your projects, but I just think it really does speak to occupational therapists, everything that you do. You're just not explicitly saying it. And like when you're talking about the COM-B model, I think, well, OTs might lean upon the COM-B model, but they'd really use their own models of practice to explain kind of the behaviour change and what we're doing. And there's just so much overlap with occupational therapy. And I know that we'd be really fantastic at delivering these programmes. And so I just obviously I'm going to be in touch with you anyway, but it's just making me think even more about how I can support the next steps and how we can encourage more OTs to be kind of involved in them next steps, really. And I know you have loads of contact with OTs as well, but thank you.
Thanks, Liz. And Daisy, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed listening to that. I had a question about whether there was any ask on NHS staff to change their practice or do anything differently. I'm asking with slightly loaded context in that I work in Derby and am doing slightly similar work of trying to build those connections between health and social care services and what exists in the community. And I often think that ask is always on the community provision or the community to change rather than on the NHS. And I'm interested in your impact and effort, because the effort for the NHS to change, I imagine, is off the graph. But actually, when Gareth, you were talking through the guide, loads of those things, I guess, are kind of the skills that you would hope practitioners and occupational therapists would be working with the person they're supporting with. And so it could be a really nice opportunity to marry it together. So yeah, I just wondered whether there was any reflections on working with staff to practice differently to maximise the opportunity rather than put the expectation all on the community provider, if that makes sense.
Yeah, do you want me to answer it? So part of we have two people who deliver the spaces intervention. We usually train up more than two within each mental health trust, but we have two people delivering it. And the people that deliver it are trained in the 2-day training programme. And part of that training is around that interacting with the community physical activity provider and ways to interact with them. And that's one of the things that we discovered in the feasibility study, was that people didn't necessarily have that confidence to approach the community physical activity provider, and the community physical activity providers lacked a bit of confidence. So it was trying to build that bridge, and that's what Co-Spaces was all about, building that bridge. So we probably didn't really explain in this presentation because we're just talking about the resources that we've made, but one of the things we did was amend our training and really strengthen that training around the NHS staff and how to interact with community providers. So that isn't all on the community provider, but it's a joint two-way process, and so we did a lot with the training programme as well around that. Gareth might want to say something more on that. He's delivered a lot of the training, and so has Tris.
Yeah, just to add, really, I think Emily's summarised the main points really well. But just in our experience, there's, and this is ongoing really, the OT role changed in its expectations a lot across a lot of different NHS trusts. And we've even recently had it, can I go into it, but as in the expectation within that trust changed longitudinally as well. So there is a lot of change kind of going on, and it depends on the leadership, it depends on the kind of what the trust is kind of kind of their KPIs and kind of their expectations and so on. So, you know, Tris mentioned it before around kind of the future, but one of the things we'd like to do with this is kind of start to talk about, like we talk about in research around systems thinking, around how do you implement different layers of the system, and some of that is within policy and so on, and kind of, well, what is the role and so on. But yeah, so there are quite small things, tweaks here and there. They're quite large things, some of which as well, and some of you you know, may already do this. There's actually some really good practice already being delivered by OTs, like kind of across, but again, it's not standardized. We go to some trusts and they're doing, you know, some really good stuff around physical activity, and we go to other trusts and that, you know, so this is the first thing they're kind of engaging in. So it really did vary a lot.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm aware that we have run over slightly, so I'm going to bring us to a close now. I know we may have more questions, but please feel free to reach out to the team or to ourselves, and we can connect you in. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Emily, Gareth and Tris. It's been wonderful to have you, and thank you for sharing your research.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks, take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.